sympathy or something that they're feeling, and then from there, a lot of the question is like, hey, what can I do? How can I come alongside of you? And I think the first thing, or like, how are you doing? And the first thing is like, that's such a loaded question, is how am I doing, right? There's so much. And so I think to answer that question of how I'm doing, when I get that question, there's trauma on top of trauma on top of trauma that we're interacting with. There's hundreds of years of slavery, injustices going on. That's traumatic. Then you have Jim Crow era. Then you have all this. You have injustices. That's let alone trauma. And then just recently, we have Ahmaud Arbery last week. Before we're even done processing that, then you have Christian Cooper getting the police called on him. Then you have George Floyd and Breonna Taylor before that. And there's more that haven't gotten the publicity that those have, right? Mm-hmm. At the hands of police officers and other white individuals. So when I ask that question, how am I doing? It's trauma on top of trauma on top of trauma. And then yet I'm expected to go to work, handle all my same responsibilities, be at full functioning, and not really given that space to really actually process what's happening. So it's a really loaded question when I'm asked how I'm doing. On top of that, I've been invited into multiple of these conversations and asked to step in and walk with people, which is okay because that's my job and I've stepped into that. And some of the questions that get brought up with that is like, what do we do? What do you think about the riots? What do you think Jesus would say right now? What does it mean to you to be Black in America? How can I walk alongside you as a white person or a non-Black person of color? What does the Bible say about what's going on? A ton of questions. And so it's trauma on top of trauma on top of trauma, carrying that, trying to go about my everyday work, and then being asked to navigate through this with other people. And it's a lot. And so I just want to say thank you to our other panelists that have stepped on here, because this is a real privilege to be able to hear from some voices that are willing to share and do the vulnerable work of sharing into where they're at and what they're processing. But that's some of the questions I get. The first one is really, how am I doing? And that's a real loaded question right now.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you. Pastor Chipo?
Hi, so my experience with this is I'm blessed because of the Kindred movement. And I want to say the reason why I feel blessed is because the first text that I got was from somebody who is part of Kindred, who is not a member of my church. It's a friend that I made in 2018, and we call each other sisters. And so she reached out, and I hear what you're saying, Chris, that question, how are you doing? You don't know how to respond. And I think I was grateful because she didn't ask me that. She said the stuff that I needed to hear that reminded me that she was my sister. And then also reminded me that she was praying. I didn't respond to her right away because when she texted me, it was on a day when I was struggling to process. Because I had been watching the news and I saw the video about what happened to Mr. Floyd. And then after that, I received another video from a family member, and they weren't sending it because they were, trying to start anything. It was just my response to it was not what I expected. It was a video related to the coronavirus. It was a reenactment of what happens when somebody says something negative to someone of Asian descent related to the coronavirus. And in the video, the lady who was insulted turned out to be the doctor who had worked for the Caucasian lady's daughter and had actually taken great care of her and made her feel better. And I think the thing that felt like a punch in my gut and that kind of made my whole body numb was when the doctor responded and said, "It doesn't matter, it's okay." And for some reason, those words, "it's okay," did not sit well with me at all. And I spent the rest of the day just being open. I just lay on the couch the whole day. I didn't do anything. I couldn't work. I didn't check emails, didn't answer phones, didn't answer text messages, because all I could hear was those words, "it's okay." And my heart was saying, but it's not okay. It's not okay to keep on saying it's okay every time something happens. And I didn't feel like it's okay was the right response to show forgiveness. It's not that I'm saying we shouldn't forgive. I'm saying forgiveness is necessary. But I think those words, it's okay, I think I'm tired of hearing them. And I did not know what to do with it. I have not engaged with people in terms of people asking me questions, but I have heard from my husband, because he's part of a Facebook group where they talk about issues in Chicago and things like that. And so they have been asking him and challenging him with the question of, how can you stay connected to a religion that doesn't say anything or address the issues that we're facing? And so that has been, I mean, not to say that I'm going to turn away from it. No, that's not what it is. But it does make you ask the question, what is it that we should be doing? And I think I've been processing that a lot this week, asking what should we doing? What should we be doing? How can we do more? And what do we do to say, to give a different response rather than just saying it's okay all the time?
Thank you, Pastor Chipo. I really appreciate your sharing that. I think we're all in a similar space. I know in my own manner of processing this, and many times when I process it, it's in response, in order to get it out of my head and share it with someone, so I won't go crazy. There is a sense of silent rage in me, because it goes back to what Chris Thurton was just saying, is that there's trauma on top of trauma. And when trauma comes consecutively, where you witness one death that has been videoed, then you read of another death, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and then back to back you have another one. And so you're traumatized consecutively, so you don't even have time to process that. And so and so some of the emails that I've gotten, I've kind of, and I just want to read one to you. It's in response to a friend who's a member of UPC, and I basically said to him, I said, I really appreciate you reaching out. It has been a difficult time for me as I process what has happened to my brothers and sisters. My heart goes out to the families of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd. I haven't been able to sleep, and I find myself waking up in the middle of the night in a sweat, because subconsciously I am in a state of trauma and I feel powerless. I want to do something constructive and not just talk about it. I'm angry and sad at the same time. I'm sick and tired of the same stories with different faces. From Emmett Till to Trayvon Martin, the story is always the same. I'm hoping that maybe this time justice may begin to roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream, and let it begin in Georgia and Minnesota and Kentucky. And that was just my response to him. I could have said a whole lot more, but I just wanted to respond to him, basically saying, I'm with you, brother. I feel your pain. I want to do something. And so every day I'm trying to deal with that trauma through prayer, through getting some of these thoughts out of my head, responding to emails so I don't go crazy. And so that's kind of where I am right now. I serve on the Community Police Commission for Seattle, and we get a lot of information firsthand, and also we get a lot of reports, initial reports of police misconduct or policies and training that police officers have to go through, and they want our input. And so constantly in the trenches trying to make sure that what is being taught, the policies that are being voted on, and the training that matches the policies, that in some way that those trainings, once the police officers have been trained, then they're held accountable on the streets. They're held accountable within the system. And so when they don't follow that, then that comes back to us and say, hey, what's going on here? You know, what's going on? And so that's, I've been doing that for 6 years, and it's been in some ways rewarding, but sometimes we take 2 steps forward and 3 steps back. And that's the frustrating part, because you want to believe that what you're doing is making a difference. And that's been the frustrating part for me. With that being said, I just want to let our participants know there will be a time where we first of all wanted to process and kind of share a little bit what we as panelists are going through and how we're processing this, but that we will be answering your questions in a few moments. But we just want to get this out in the air and share a little bit about how we're processing it. You know, I often tell people, you know, I want to be like Jesus, but I'm not there yet. I really want to be like him, but there's this other part of me. Lord, I believe, but help my unbelief. Lord, I believe that you are a God of justice, but Lord, sometimes when I look at society, help my unbelief, because some of the things that we see in society seems to contradict. And Jeremiah had that problem. Ezekiel had that problem. Lord, I know that you're on the side of the righteous, but why are the wicked why are they flourishing? Why what they do is, you know, why is what they're doing seems to be promoted. So that's the challenge when we as Christians, we're trying to live righteous and be a voice for the voiceless. So are there any and this is kind of between us, any questions that we want to ask one another in terms, because all of us are in different contexts. Mr. Chris Thurton is working with university students. Chipo, you're working with young people. I'm working with adult discipleship. And we're all working in different contexts. And so, you know, what kind of questions do we have for one another?
Before we do that, I'm curious. I want to hear how Chris is processing as a white man.
Yes.
In all of this. Chris, if you'd be willing to share where you're at today.
Sure. I feel a lot of despair. So as the oldest person on this panel by far, I've witnessed just a lot of brokenness in the culture. So I think about the Watts riots, I think about the shooting of Martin Luther King, I think about death after death after death, Rodney King. Now we've had these, Will Smith had this great quote, prejudice isn't, racism isn't getting worse, it's now just being filmed. And there's this horrible sense that we have just watched and watched and watched. We have good friends in Massachusetts, a pastor and his wife, Virginia and Larry. He's the bishop of a large Black Pentecostal church. They have 2 sons who are a year younger than our sons. All 4 men went to elite schools, colleges, incredibly successful. As Larry and Virginia and Ellen and I shared our experiences of bringing up our kids, I never talked to my kids about how to think about the police when they go to the mall. I never had to talk to my kids about what happens when they're on the highway and a police car stops them. I didn't worry every time my kids were out if they were going to end up dead. That weighs on me all the time. I think about Mark and Paul a lot. And I think it's the sense of despair and discouragement that, especially those of us who have the opportunity to escape the despair, that we end up doing that. And I think that's the thing that's been sitting with the most as a white man, older white man in this setting, to realize that I have the option of stepping out, and so I mustn't do it. That I have to stay somewhere as best I can in that despair and the anger so that I don't opt out and not use what I have to try to change what's going on, even if I'm not sure what that is. I can never understand the experience of Black men and women in this country, but I can stand with and try to allow myself to empathize and to feel. And I think white folks especially, it's really easy to step in and out. and to kind of say, well, you know, it'll get better, and it doesn't get better. So, yeah.
Thanks, Chris. Really appreciate that. So I think, as we've shared a little bit about how we're processing this, let me start with Chipo first in terms of how youth, how are you ministering to youth in this context? How are they processing it?
I had the opportunity on Sunday to talk to a few of them. A lot of them didn't connect, and I still haven't heard back from them why they didn't. The ones that were there, they're processing it by pretty much by withdrawing. They're not trying to watch the news. They don't want to hear about it. They don't want to talk about it. I know they did eventually appreciate that we did talk about it on Sunday, but I know their initial response was they didn't want to do that. Because for them, they're already taxed with all of the stress with the coronavirus, trying to figure out what the next step is, and this was like another thing that they needed to deal with, and that they want to do it, so they're kind of like trying to go into that space of escaping and avoid the conversation as much as possible.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Chris Thurton.
Yeah. Let's see, two things. I guess a couple things. A lot. I've seen these questions pop up here already, and I think these are a lot of the similar questions that I'm getting from college students. I guess it comes from different places. So when I'm interacting, Chipo, kind of like you said, Pastor Chipo, with when I'm interacting with some of our Black students, we're just coming together in solidarity. Like that's what that is. Like, we're coming together, we're lamenting, we're grieving, we're being together. And a lot of the things that we talk about, and I'll just bring y'all behind our white brothers and sisters and non-Black POCs behind the curtain of conversations I'm having, is there's a lament of what's happening. But there's also this lament that there's a lot of white people that their only experience with Black culture right now is negative ones, or they see like just what pop culture gives them. And so now there's an understanding that Black culture is either you're a basketball player, a rapper, or whatever you might see in pop culture, or you're someone that's getting murdered and killed. And so there's this idea of, if you are not this idea of what success is that society might be showing you, then you're to be pitied. And to sit with students that are in that space and processing that people are pitying them is horrible. And so I guess one of the things that I want to address in that is the Black experience is deep and rich and beautiful, and there's so much to it, and there's beauty and life in it. And when it's just narrowed down to this one idea of success, or this one idea of strictly tragedy, you're missing all the richness. There's this quote that's going around right now that says, they love our culture, but they hate us. And that's how a lot of our students are feeling, is that people consume this culture of what it looks like to be a successful Black person in pop culture, or just this deep pity and grief and sadness. And it's like, there's a richness and a beauty. And so, like y'all said, I'm very appreciative when people reach out and say, hey, I'm grieving with you. I want that. I need that. I also want people to recognize that there's a beauty and a depth in that brokenness as well, right? The other thing is then with white students and non-Black students of color, they a lot of times they're asking, what can we do right away? And those are two questions we saw right here, is like, how do we step into hope? And how do we, what can we do to support? And I'll just speak in this. What I found traditionally in white culture is a need to move into action quickly. And a lot of other cultures that are not predominantly white understand this idea of sitting in this lament and grief a little bit more. And that would be that's the first conversation that I start having, is like, hey, yes, we want to see action. And yes, I want you to learn how you can take action steps. But the first thing I want for you to do with me is just come and grieve with me, lament with me. You don't have to come bring me a meal, because I got a meal, I got a job, I can cook. But what I just need you to enter into this grief, enter into empathy with me. And the action steps that take place are ones of learning, listening, grieving, doing your own homework, not coming to your Black friend Google, but going to actual Google and looking things up, and learning for yourself, and then seeing that there is opportunities to donate money, to come alongside organizations to change the way your spending habits, where you're putting your dollar, what books are you reading to your kids, what are you exposing your kids to, how are you exposing your kids to a deeper, richer history that's outside of your own cultural bubble. There's a lot that you can do that you don't have to just do for me personally, but you can do for the culture. And that's the big thing there. And then I guess when it's about hope, when I get asked the question about hope, because students ask this a lot, and I think everybody does. When I get asked the question about hope, I was reflecting on this personally this past weekend. I was on a run, Rainier was popping, and I was listening to Tasha Cobb's This Is a Move. If you haven't heard it, go look it up. She's a rock star, and she's got pipes. This Is a Move. And that's my plug, you got that. And she talks about mountains are still being moved. And I was sitting there and I'm running and I see this view of Rainier, and the Lord just spoke over me, hey, you know what hope is? Hope is fighting to see mountains moved, even if they're not moved in your lifetime, but still fighting like hell to see them moved. Mm-hmm. And that's what hope is. Hope is that we are going to never give up. And so what I'm seeing right now is a lot of passion from people. People are really passionate, but that passion needs to be moved into faithfulness, because as we remain faithful to the things that we're being called to right now, we will see this hope garnered and spurred up in us to actually see these mountains moved. And hopefully, God willing, they'll actually be moved in our lifetime. And so that's a lot of what I've been processing with students, talking with students through. And it breaks my heart. For me, I came to this realization that I was fighting for my kids' generations at 23. And so our college students are processing that right now at their young age. They're saying like, the things I'm fighting for, I probably won't even see in my own lifetime. And that breaks my heart. And so I guess that there's a call to all of us, like, hey, if we want to see some of these changes happen sooner, like we can't just be passionate about it in the moment in a reactionary way. We got to be faithful in a proactive way.
Amen. Amen. Thank you, Chris. Thank you so much. You know, from my perspective, serving as pastor of adult discipleship, and serving in the context of a predominantly white church. Many of you know I served as the pastor of Mount Zion for 9 years, and there was a paradigm shift for me when I left Mount Zion and came over to UPC. That I'm always cognizant of. When I was at Mount Zion, I was expected to speak truth to power. I was expected to be somewhat political in my sermons, to combine theology and politics together, the politics of Jesus and how Jesus engaged the culture. Dr. King is definitely a model of mine. Reverend Jesse Jackson, Jeremiah Wright, all of these prophets have been mentors of mine. And so when I made the transition from Mount Zion to UPC, the question that I struggled with was, can I be my true self here at UPC? Can I preach the same sermons that I preached at Mount Zion? Or should I preach the same sermons? So those were the questions that I struggled with, because at Mount Zion, I was preaching to people who were oppressed. I would go to be invited by a mother to go to the courthouse to speak on behalf of her son. I would go to the hospital. A young man has been shot, and visit him and pray with him. I went to the hospital, a 2-year-old girl in the back seat with her and she's in the back seat, her mother and father in the front seat. A man pulls up to the car, shoots into the car, and kills their daughter. That's the kind of context I was ministering in. And then I come over to UPC, and I'm preaching to privileged people. They don't have the same issues, the same challenges. So in my mind, I'm struggling with, Lord, what can I say in this context? You know, what relevance do I have in this context? And it was clear to me, the Lord said, you just keep preaching what I put in your heart. You keep preaching what I put in you. You are a channel. You are a vessel of mine. You keep preaching. Use your own personality, but use the truth that I put in your heart to preach. And so I had to be comfortable with that. And, you know, also I think there's a challenge of being in a predominantly white church. We're in the context where there are members at UPC who want to ask me questions as if I have all the answers. Aaron, what do you have to say about this? You know, and it puts me in an awkward situation because I can't be that for everybody. And so that's been a challenge for me. But also at the same time, knowing that God sent me to University Presbyterian Church, knowing that I'm there for a reason, and to be my true self, not to assimilate into the culture, but to be my true self and speak life into people who are still, who have microaggressions. They don't know, some don't know how to handle my presence there at UPC. And so I have to ask the Lord, help me to love everyone here, because they're your children, they're your people, and help me to be faithful, to be found faithful here in this context. And so that's been, and to help people understand that reconciliation is a part of discipleship. Ethnic awareness is a part of discipleship. That's why we're reading Sarah Shin's book. That's why Kindred exists, because reconciliation is a part of discipleship. Reconciliation is a marathon. It's a long distance run, and it just doesn't happen overnight. Just because God said it, we still got to lean into the reality of that. And ethnic awareness, you got to understand that I'm a Black man who have come and come from a long generation of Black men and women who have been traumatized, and their trauma is deeply embedded in my psyche. So I'm dealing with historical trauma and present trauma as a result of that. And so it's a complex situation, and it requires that we as Christians always be in a posture of humility when it comes to being in relationship with one another and understanding the reality of the conditions that we find ourselves in. And I'm going to stop there because I can start preaching, so let me stop right there. Mr. Nichols, what are your thoughts, sir?
Well, wow. I think the thing in my conversations, and there are two things that have been on my mind most. It is imperative, so I'm going to speak to white people who are on this call today. We have to do our homework. So we have to understand our history in the US. We have to know the system that was established that allowed this to happen today. We have to know where we fit and why it keeps feeding us into the best way possible. It's not out of our merit. It's not because we're more talented. It's because the system has been designed from the signing of the Constitution to today for us. That's not about self-hate, that's about knowledge. So it's really critical that every white person on this call do your historical work to understand. And I just want to mention two books that were changed my life. And again, this is about a willingness to feel the pain of what we've been a part of. So Slavery by Another Name by Douglas Blackmon. Every white person should read that book. Here's a shocking fact I didn't know before I read this years ago. The last legal case against slavery was in 1941. And the person who was prosecuted got a fine of $500. When we talk about slavery ending in 1865, it didn't. So we need to know that. We need to understand how our system works. And the other book is Michelle Alexander, The New Jim Crow. Those are transformative works that all of us who are white, Caucasian, of any ethnicity need to read. Plus, incredible more. So it's imperative that we do our homework so that we can understand what the system is, because you can't fight a system that's benefiting you. You can talk about it, but it is so tempting to do nothing because you're benefiting from it every day. And so I feel it in myself, the effort I'm trying to put in to understand and to realize if I make a certain choice, this is going to disadvantage me. And do I want that? And that's how evil plays its card. Wow. So, and I just want to reiterate again that we have to be able to feel pain and lament. White people, Presbyterians, this is not meant to be a slam at anyone, but those of us who are more of the liberal side politically, it's easy to get angry at other white people and feel like we're doing justice, but we have a hard time lamenting because we don't want to feel pain. So those are the two things I think I'd say.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris.
Chris, you said something awesome just now, right? You said you have to recognize how you've benefited from the system and then actively seek to dismantle that in your own life. And you said you used the word disadvantage yourself. And what's interesting in that is a lot of times, and I have a lot of these conversations where people, particularly white people, but anytime anybody has a position of power and now there is being justice or equality or equity being brought about, as they lose some of that power that they've held, and I now feel that they are being oppressed. But the reality is they have been benefiting from these systems of oppression. And so what you're saying, one of the analogies I love best to describe this is by Dr. Brian Loritz in his book, Right Color, Wrong Culture. And he talks about this idea of a football game. And he says, if you play the whole first half of a football game and one team is getting all the calls, they get all the penalties go their way, they go up 50-0. The coach of the losing team goes to the refs at halftime and says, "Excuse me, sir, you've been calling this game disproportionately. Can you please call it equally now?" The ref's like, "Yeah, I got it." If he calls it equal the rest of the way, the losing team's still down 50 points. That's actually not justice. That's just now you've set equality. That's not justice. For there to actually be justice, the game needs to be called the other way now. Mm-hmm. And so that is really, when we talk about this idea of justice, and we talk about dismantling oppression, we talk about dismantling systems, we're not saying, oh, white people, now you need to be oppressed so that other people can be lifted up. We're saying we actually need to, it's a power conversation. And the way Jesus plays into this is Jesus, one, is the ultimate example of giving up his power so that others could have life. He gave up everything so that we could have everything, so we could have a chance at life. And if we believe Jesus is who he says he is, then we believe that there's an unlimited power source that we have. So then we should be able to freely give away any power that we have, knowing that he will give it back to us, right? Mm-hmm. And so then as followers of Jesus, we should be the first to dismantle systems, the first to uplift the oppressed, the first to reach out. It's our mandate to take care of the widows, take care of the fatherless. And that is whoever is facing injustice, right? And so that is a literal biblical mandate to do so. And it becomes a power conversation that we need to recognize the places that we have power in our life and we can begin to dismantle them.
Amen. Amen. Thank you, Chris. Thank you. I think, at this point we want to transition and open it up for questions. We have a few questions, Q&A. And see here what we have.
Pastor Aaron, there was a question that was asked for you as someone who serves on the Community Police Commission. The question was, what are the kinds of things that have to happen to change police force culture that will start to prevent, to really hold back this violent behavior from some of the officers? and they're asking for your perspective on how much change and what kind needs to be faced.
Thank you for that question. You know, one of a dear friend of mine, Sue Rahr, she used to be a sheriff here in Seattle, and Sue is in the process of training new officers down in Olympia, and her philosophy is that we need to train police officers to transition them from thinking like warriors to be guardian. There's this militarization of the police department that many police officers served in the military, and that same mindset, same psyche is brought into the police department. And so that there's her training now is based on getting them out of that mindset and training them to be guardians, training them to understand that they are public servants, that they're not called to protect a particular segment of people. And so the policies, the training is all pointing toward that. We have many police officers who have been on the force for 20 to 30 years, and there was a different mindset, a different way of thinking that they have. Many of the police officers who are coming off the force, and there's a huge vacuum right now, especially in the Seattle Police Department, where they're understaffed. I would have to say that Chief Betts is a breath of fresh air. She knows that SBD is not perfect, but she's really striving hard to bring reform and to bring a sense of compassionate policing to the atmosphere at SBD. But what we see happening across the United States right now is that when we recognize what's going on, that many of these police departments are corrupt, or you have a few police officers who just kind of mess up the whole bunch. And what we're really discovering is that, yes, we know reform needs to happen. And then they hire someone, they bring in someone to be a consultant, and they do an analysis, they give recommendations, what needs to be done. And the next thing that happens is, it seems like they're trying to move in that direction. Next thing happens, they put it on the shelf and they go back to default mode. That's what happened in Minnesota, because right when Philando Castile was shot and killed, they had experts come in. There were some police officers that were fired. There was a lot of work being done. Next thing you know, they put all of those recommendations on the shelf and everything went back to default mode. But the other issue is those same police officers, just like the one that just shot George Floyd, he's been part of that police department for 19 years and had 18 cases of misconduct against him, and no one held them accountable. That's happening across the board in the United States. There's no consistent, and some of it has to do with union, collective bargaining agreement, union, and I understand the importance of having a union, that police officers need a voice as well. There's a lot of factors that contribute to that lack of accountability. But for the most part, it's an unjust system. It's deeply rooted. It's deeply rooted, not just in law enforcement, but the legal system. We even see it, based on what we've seen with the medical examiners' analysis of George Floyd. You constantly see that throughout the legal system, and there's a downward spiral of where there's a lack of trust, because at the end of the day, it seems like the system is built against Black and brown bodies. And the reality of that can be seen in prison. You know, we only make up 12% of the population, but we make up 60% of those who are in prison. So that's the challenge that we're facing today. I would say that Seattle Police Department, by and large, has been a model for other cities. Because we have a community police commission, a civilian oversight that's recommending policies and holding it, and it's independent. So our commission is independent. So we dialogue with the mayor. We can disagree with the mayor. We can disagree with city council. We can disagree with the police department, and still not be threatened by that, because we are an independent unit that we work in such a way that there's supposed to be checks and balances. And I don't know if that answers your question, but I'm hopeful. This is a marathon. We're working toward that end. Police reform is an ongoing process, and we really have to do our due diligence in making sure that the right kinds of police officers are on the police department. The police department throughout history has been replete with men who have been part of the Ku Klux Klan, been part, you know, and they hide under the guise of being a police, you know, and so there's a long history there, and we have to be aware of that. And so we have to do our due diligence, and the community plays a major role in that as well.
Thank you, Pastor Aaron.
Yeah, thank you. There's two questions I'd love to kind of mesh together, see if we can't hit them both, two birds with one stone. And the first one is, it says, what would you say to Asians on this call that can often feel, they say, often they can feel that they don't engage in this conversation or don't know how to, when they've benefited in many ways from the current system, as well as benefiting from the civil rights movement won by African Americans. And then the other question that I'd like to kind of pair with this, maybe as a 1A or 1B, is in an attempt to lament with those who suffer, how do we include other oppressed groups in this conversation? I'm curious how other panelists would interact with these questions.
Chris, can you repeat the question about Asian Americans?
Yes, I will read it verbatim this time. What would you say to Asians on this call? Often we can feel that we don't need to engage in this conversation, or we don't know how, when we have benefited in many ways from the current system, as well as benefiting from the civil rights won by African Americans.
I think one of the things that comes to mind, it's not really like a answer to say, oh, this is the solution. But one of the things that comes to mind is something that Chris Nichols mentioned earlier about educating ourselves. Because I think there is, I don't know what the right word is, but I think we have been brought up to believe that Asian Americans are not part of the struggle. But like, if you have the opportunity to go to, I think it's called the Asian American Museum in International District, you get to see how we struggled together, especially here locally in Seattle. And there's names of people that you never know unless you go to that museum. And I think one of the things that we need to do is re-educate ourselves on how we have partnered together in the past, and how we did stand in solidarity. And so I think we've come to a place, because we thought that we did it separately, that now we continue to do everything separately. And that's one of the struggles that I know we faced through colonialism, because I grew up in Zimbabwe, which ended up being a colony of Britain, is the way stories are told. It makes people think, oh, this is my struggle and my struggle alone. And so that's how you end up with tribe fighting against tribe instead of people banding together around a common issue. And I think it starts with us first re-educating ourselves and realizing that it has never been one race's struggle. Yes, each race faced different aspects of it, but it has always been a collective struggle. And I think when we recognize that, I think that'll change the way that we approach these issues.
One thing I might add is that that I think absolutely agree. We need to educate ourselves, especially those of us who have wanted to exclude people who are different. So you see the patterns, right? The Japanese internment, Chinese exclusion laws in California, the border issues that are active and going on. There's a pattern of how the US deals with race and how white people advantage of that. So, but it's also critical in my mind that we understand that all of our understanding about race is based on slavery. And so we learned about, we were educated, we were taught, we've been ingrained with the understanding of how race fits what race is because of our experience out of slavery. It's still a current issue. And so I think everyone needs to learn about that story, but then hear the other stories as well. And the last thing I'll just mention is I think it's really critical right now that as we're dealing with the horror of Black men and women being shot in the street, we not forget the border and the things that are going on there.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, it's interesting. I absolutely understanding history and recognizing this. And I think part of it is recognizing the collective and the individual. So for Asian American brothers and sisters, or just anybody who's a non-Black person of color, right? How do we acknowledge the specificity of this conversation? And not just, and this is the same thing, how do we suffer with others? How do we suffer specifically how do we lament specifically what we are actually lamenting in the conversation at hand, right? And so that does not mean, and we live in ways, in such a binary world that we think, oh, if we're interacting with this, we can't also interact with this. That's not true. There's power in the word and the reality is the suffering of Asian Americans in this world is true, and the suffering of Black people in this world is true. And so when we enter into suffering, one of the things that I think is really difficult for a lot of Black people right now is understanding that when we fought for civil rights, it was for all, but then we see a bunch of movements coming out of civil rights that are specific. And right now we're saying, in some ways, we got lost along the way. And so as we enter into this conversation, it's important to specifically enter into the lament in this conversation. And that is not to forget the lament of other conversations, but it is to highlight this one because it is one that has been forgotten and put on the back burner in lots of ways. And so we need to embrace the power of and in our lives and say, yes, as an Asian American, I face my own prejudice, bias, and racism on a daily basis. And I can see the struggle of my Black brothers and sisters, Black and brown brothers and sisters that they're facing right now. And for this time, in this places, we fight to see the change that needs to happen for them in this community. We're going to enter into this conversation wholeheartedly. And that doesn't forget about the other conversations. It's just saying this is on the forefront of our mind and energy right now. And that's the same thing with suffering, right? Like comparative suffering is such a difficult thing to do. You can't do that. It's just not healthy. And so we all are suffering in different ways. And as soon as we start to compare and say, well, your suffering is not as bad as my suffering is not as bad. You can't tell people where they should be at in suffering. And so as we enter in and learn how to suffer with people, we have to, again, embrace that power of and recognize, like, I might be suffering. I might be a part of a different marginalized group. I might be suffering in a different way, but how can I enter into the suffering in this group, right? And so that's just a space that we have to hold that tension and live in that.
Very well said. Very well. So I think just to piggyback on what you're saying, because to me, when you look at Asian culture, Black culture, there's so many nuances in how these respective cultures are viewed by the dominant race. There's different value placed on Asian culture, and there's a different value placed on Black culture. I was talking to a young man who worked for Microsoft, and Microsoft has a particular culture that you have to subscribe to, and these are his words to me, is that in some of these high level meetings, the higher you get at Microsoft, the less people of color you see, the higher you get. And his assessment is, as far as Asian culture is, Asian people are too polite. They're too polite to move up the scale. And this is a person from another culture, and he said that they're too polite. They respect people too much to make it up all the way up to high level positions. And I was shocked when he said that to me. And but that's his assessment. That's his assessment. He said, and of course, when you get up there, you certainly don't see Blacks up there. 2 years ago, Reverend Jesse Jackson came here, and when I was pastor Mount Zion, he called and said, I want to have a meeting there. And I said, anytime you want to come here, Reverend Jesse Jackson, you're open to come. And so he had a meeting, and he talked about economic empowerment, and that Seattle has been off the radar screen in terms of economic empowerment. And he said there are more millionaires per capita in Seattle than any city in the United States. There are more millionaires here. And he said people of color, Black people, have not gotten a piece of that economic pie. And so he has met consistently with executives from Microsoft and executives from Amazon, and his preaching is always the same. I don't see any people of color in your executive positions. Yes, they got jobs working for Microsoft, but there's nobody at the top. There's no people of color up there, especially no Blacks up there. He said the same thing about Amazon, and I had the opportunity to spend a whole day with him and to go to a Amazon shareholders meeting and to see how he assessed the situation. Here I am sitting with a man who marched with Dr. King. You've seen police brutality, eyewitness of police brutality, has been in the middle of vicious mobs, and was right there on the balcony when Dr. King was killed. This man has witnessed a lot. And so I'm listening to him and watching how he interacts with the audience. And he leans over to me and he says, look over this crowd of shareholders. And I looked around the crowd. He said, what's wrong with this picture? I said, there's no Black people in here but me, you, and your assistant. It was only 3 of us there. And it was probably about 300, close to 400 people in that room. And he said, this is what I'm talking about. This is, we are not getting a piece of the economic pie. He said, I will continue to come to Seattle until I see Black shareholders, until I see Black people in some of those positions. And it dawned on me, here's a man who has witnessed this kind of brutality consecutively over the years. And here we are, 2020, and nothing has changed. Nothing has changed, even though he's been fighting for this for a long time. But there's some nuances here that the majority culture places on ethnic groups, on Hispanics, on Asians, on Blacks. You're valued for this particular thing. You're valued for this particular thing. You're a great athlete. You're great in this. And there's different values that have been placed on us. And we, as people of color, have to be cognizant of that we have been placed in a spot where the dominant group says, this is the value we put on you. And we have to counter that. We have to counter that.
Absolutely. It's interesting that so comes from a place of majority culture being in the space of feeling that their culture is what's normal and everybody else's culture is exotic or coming in. And and that's what's beautiful about UPC going through the book Colorblind right now, Beyond Colorblind, is as you recognize that you have an ethnicity, that you have a culture that you bring, it dismantles this idea that your status quo is the normal. And now it says that what you recognize that your culture is what's normal for you, and what's culture for other people is what's normal for them. And what happens is we start to recognize that we can break that down and recognize that when people step into our lives that have a different cultural background and makeup, that they're not abnormal. Right. To them, you are abnormal. Yes. Right. And what is unfortunate is when the majority culture sees their culture as what is normal and sets it as a status quo, it does not leave room or give space for other normals to come in and thrive, not just survive, but thrive and advance and move forward.
Wow.
We got more questions.
Should we start from the top and work our way down? We got to respect the first people who said that question.
Yeah. Can I combine a couple more questions? Is that all right with us?
Yes.
Yeah.
So there's a question about this idea of power and how can we relinquish power, and also like how can white people and non-Black POCs enter into engaging in pain and lament and coming alongside in strategies without taking over. And so the question about power is do we have personal examples of how we've seen that done? So I guess the question I want to pose is, when we've seen majority culture step into minority culture to come alongside either in lament or in organization, how have you seen that done well? And how have you seen that demonstrated well?
Wow.
So just to clarify, you're saying the question is, where have we seen the dominant culture come alongside the struggle?
Yes.
Right.
And maybe to add on to that, how have they relinquished some of their power to empower others?
Mm-hmm. So the example I have is not from like the context of people of color being killed. It's from the context of mission work. And what I saw an organization that does mission work in Guatemala. They're an American group, and they are all Caucasian. And what they did when they went to Guatemala, because Guatemala, there's a high level of poverty there. And they also have the situation with the, basically related to the immigration struggle. You have families who are trying to come to the United States to get work and take care of their families. And then the family gets separated because those who are not born in the US are sent back home. And so what ends up happening is, as a parent, if you're the one being sent back home, it's a difficult decision to say, I'm gonna leave my child in the US because they are a US citizen. So the option is then you end up taking your child with you. But now you have this child who doesn't quite fit in the culture in Guatemala because that's not where they were born and raised. And so they're struggling with their identity. And so they, in a desire to find identity, they end up gravitating towards people who are offering them, that embrace. And we know that one of the groups that offers that is the gang lifestyle. And so there's a group in one of the neighborhoods that was recruiting. They were actually seeking out the young boys who had been sent back to Guatemala because they knew that they were in that state of pain and lament and not knowing what to do. And so this organization was started by a group of Guatemalan mothers to be able to try to help keep those boys out of the gangs and even try to rescue some of them from the gangs. And what the American organization did when they went into Guatemala, instead of saying, oh, we know better, we're here, we have the money, we have the resources, we'll start something for you. What they did was they did their research, and they went around asking the community, who is it that is doing something that is working for the people that needs support? And when they found the group of mothers who was doing it, they said to them, tell us your story. And the ladies shared their story. And then they said to them, what is it that we can do to help you? And what they did in that process is they only do what the mothers ask them to do. They don't come with their own ideas. They don't come with their own suggestions. And so if the mothers say, we just want you to pray, that's what they do. If they say, we want you to walk the streets with us, that's what they do. If they say, we need money to send this child to school, then they will find that money. But they never come in saying, we are the experts and we know. They always say, we are here to learn, and we are here to support you, and whatever you need, we are here for it. And they do all of that support as it is asked. And what they have done through that process is they have branched out to other organizations. So they now have helped another team that wanted to start a school for children who were low income, and they helped them in every capacity that they were asked to help. They also helping pastors to train and raise other pastors. And so everything that they do is about coming alongside local agencies that are already doing the work and not taking over and not showing their faces. And I thought that was really powerful in the way that, because it leaves the local people to be the voice, and the local people to be the ones that are pushing the change. And yeah, that's all I have.
Wow, that's good. You know, I guess for me, having worked on Community Police Commission for 6 years now, and I've seen many transitions. People who have worked on it for 2 years and 3 years, and then people go off. And so there's only two of us left that have been on as long as myself and Reverend Harriet Walden. But I'm always amazed at some of the men and women who serve on Community Police Commission. And one particular young lady who's very outspoken on the commission, and she often says, because her philosophy is Black and brown people are the people who are most impacted by police brutality in Seattle. And whenever we meet, she wants to hear from us first. She said, let us hear from so-and-so. She's a Black woman. She has a daughter. She has a son. Let's hear from her first. Or let us hear from Reverend Williams first. Let us hear from Reverend Walden first, because primarily we're at this table because of the mistreatment of Black and brown people. This is a white woman who is sharing her power and being a voice for people of color. There's only a few of us on the commission. And so I'm always honored and amazed by her voice. And that's one way. But also at UPC, Pastor George has been has shared his power with me, giving me many of opportunities to preach, to speak, to share my pastoral gifts at the church. And so he's a man of God who is not intimidated, he believes that whatever gifts God gives you, that he wants them to be used at UPC. And so I have to say, Pastor George has been a man who's been willing to share his power.
Yeah, that's good. I get a couple things, because I always got a couple things. Yeah, when we're entering into space as outsiders coming in, you have to be aware of intent versus impact. we can go in with the best intent in the world, but our impact can be negative. So you gotta be aware of that as you do that. And so that's why doing your homework, studying up, knowing yourself, knowing the gifts and skills that you have to bring to the table, but also recognizing what you're stepping into and deferring to the culture that you're stepping into, right? We go to the Dominican Republic every year. And if we went in with this American understanding of time into the Dominican Republic and enforce that ideal onto the local Dominicans while we were there, we would cause so much chaos and disruption to what's going on there, and it would hurt way more. So a book you can look up is When Helping Hurts. That will be a fantastic resource for you. We'll put it in the chat. And so when we enter into a space and we try to help as an outsider stepping in, we have to come in humbly as learners, willing to listen. And when I say humble, I mean knowing ourselves accurately. I don't mean knowing ourselves lower. Know what we have to bring to the table. Like, y'all, white people step into conversations. You have gifts and skills to bring. Know that, what you have to bring, but also recognize that you're stepping into someone else's world, right? I use this analogy. It's a dinner table analogy. A lot of times people of color are invited to the table, but they aren't given the opportunity to cook. When you're stepping into someone else's world, you're sitting down at their table and you're saying, you cook, and I'm coming to partake in what you're doing. I'm gonna bring my skills to what I have. So that's one thing. The second thing is examples of ways. That's the tip of the iceberg. I got lots to talk about, but I won't go down that road. The second thing is ways I've seen this. One, the ways that Pastor Aaron just said, Pastor George has given up power. Mike McAvoy, who's the director of the Inn, he this year has given over main speaking duties to myself. And so I'm the main voice that students hear from at the Inn on Tuesday nights. And that isn't because I'm such a better speaker than Mike. That's because we believe that students need to hear from a different voice, for justice, it's important for students to see a Black face up front speaking regularly. And we try to have women speakers, women of different colors, we are representing the kingdom from up front. And so Mike has relinquished what some would call his duty as a director to speak regularly, to give that away. The other thing is that I've seen very tangibly is I know someone who, she is actually a woman of color, but she enters into spaces, gets jobs because of her ethnicity that other people of color don't necessarily get. And she's good at her job and works up the ladder. But then when she's ready, she only does that for a little bit. She does that to break the glass ceiling. And then she then recruits the person that is best suited ethnically and culturally to have that job and position. So literally what she does is she'll go in. So one of them is she worked in a prison reform ministry, but she realized that most people coming through the prison reform were Black men. And she said, as an Indian American woman, I should not be running this organization. But she had been given that duty. She did her best, her due diligence to do that. And then when the time was ready, she built somebody up. She built up a committee, first of all, that represented the community she's serving. And then when the time was right, she relinquished her power, stepped down, and passed it off to somebody because she knew she'd have other opportunities. Yeah. And so that's when we talk about this idea of power. When you have it and you have a multitude of opportunities, how do you give away maybe an opportunity that you have and someone else has when it's their only opportunity and you might have multiple other ones?
Wow. Wow, that's good.
I think I would add that for white people in particular, that it's incredibly important to discover how unaware we are of the power that we hold. And we can have really good intentions, but because we haven't been in spaces where we're not in the majority, then we don't understand what's happening around us. So a really simple thing that is incredibly important is that every white person has spaces where they're in the minority and they aren't in charge, and then wrestle with their own feelings. Sit there and think, why am I uncomfortable? Why is this difficult? That's essential, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. What's another question that we
this one's fascinating to me. Is in the face of recent tragedy, how can this be a segue or a catalyst to talk to people about becoming Christians, to have the ultimate piece of salvation with Christ? After all, the Great Commission commands us to use every opportunity to reach people's hearts, to bring them to Christ in Christian faith in the ultimate justice.
That's a good question. You know, I think for the most part, we are called to make disciples of all nations. But that statement in and of itself implies ethnic awareness. You know, you make disciples of all nations. So I think in the context that we're in right now, based on what that old saying by Francis of Assisi, you know, preach the gospel and if necessary, use words. So I think when in this context where there's a lot of tension in the air, a lot of violence, a lot of chaos, how can we as Christians be a visible demonstration of the gospel? And I think the way we open the door for our words is through our service. And we have to find points in society where we ask the question, how can we serve? How can we help? How can we love our city? And then when we begin to love our city, we roll up our sleeves and love our city in tangible ways, people will want to know about the hope that is within us. I think sometimes we want to share the gospel first and serve second. God wants us to serve first and share the gospel second, because that gives us credibility. They've seen people sharing the gospel before, but they haven't seen enough people, Christians serving and then sharing the gospel, because serving gives us credibility. And that's I think that opens the door for being a tangible witness to the gospel of Jesus Christ. And I think that's what's most needed right now in our society. I was just thinking, yesterday when we were having the Pentecost service, beautiful service, wonderful worship, expression of the multi-ethnic family of God. But meanwhile, the city is being just rampage. I mean, things are just being torn, cars on fire, all of those things are happening. And I saw later on, earlier today, that there were people in downtown Seattle cleaning up. They were serving, sweeping up the glass, cleaning up the trash, because they love the city. As Christians, we should be the first people down there. If we love the city, if we love Seattle, how can we tangibly show our love to Seattle in such a time as this? Kindred was born out of recognizing police brutality all over the land and country. It was born out of that, and so that's part of our DNA. We're not just called to worship, come together, study the Bible. We're not coming together just to become smarter sinners or smarter saints. God wants us to be a tangible witness for him in serving. And that's what we see in Acts as well. It wasn't just, so they kept giving themselves to the breaking of bread, to prayer, the apostles' teaching, but then they broke camp and said, how do we minister to the needs of the community here? They broke camp after. And I think that's the part many times that we miss, and I believe that's the track that we've been on for the past 2 years, 3 years, in terms of the next door neighbor movement in our church. Is that how can we bring the gospel into our neighborhoods and into the community so that we can serve effectively and be a tangible witness to open up the door for the gospel.
That's good, Pastor.
It's interesting, the idea of salvation as one soul being saved is actually a very Greek idea. If we look at the Hebrew and we look at what Jesus was teaching, it's a holistic salvation that he's talking about. So you look at any time that Jesus forgave someone of their sins, he also healed them of a physical ailment. He healed them of a of a relational ailment. He healed them of something that was tangible. There was a justice action that went on as well. And so when we talk about this idea of helping people, leading people to faith, it's a holistic one. And so we can't just do one without the other. So we need both. Secondly, when we talk about Christian, we have to understand what we're saying. Are we talking about people becoming Christian and adhering to this Christian culture, this Western Christian culture that that has become the norm for so many Christians, specifically here at UPC? Or are we talking about people living into the reality of their son and daughtership of Jesus, their son and daughtership of the God of the universe? Yeah. If that's what we're talking about, then the beginning point or the end point actually doesn't matter. We start with love. That's the beginning point. And we love them holistically. And them coming to know Jesus, that's the salvation moment, the freedom that comes in Jesus. It's not just that people would then adhere to this Christian culture and start listening to Hillsong and doing those things. It's that people would come to know the living God of the universe, and that God is a person, and that God is a holistic one, and that God works in ways beyond what I can comprehend. So as we love people into that kingdom, I never know exactly when they come. There's times where they have professions of faith, and that's fantastic, and we celebrate that. But it's not on me to judge and know the heart. It's on me to love, represent the kingdom of God, and love people into that kingdom, and help them recognize their fullness as in their identity as a son or daughter of the King of the universe.
Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
It's really good.
Yeah.
You know, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I like what both of you said about like tapping into the areas where we can serve, and tapping into the areas where we can show love. For the people who are listening, just to share, we talked earlier a little bit about some of the stuff that we have seen. And I had shared that my husband has been interacting with people on Facebook. So he's interacting with people who are in Chicago that he grew up with, friends that he hasn't seen in a long time, and a lot of them are struggling and trying to process all of the violence that has been going on. And what he does is he has been meeting them where they are. So he looks at like how they're phrasing their comments, or looks at the statements that they're making. And then what he has been doing is been helping to show where basically our global theology has been wrong in understanding, you know, how we're supposed to operate as Christians, and kind of inviting people to go into that process of really seeing what Jesus meant, like you said, Chris, about what is salvation, not the idea of, you know, what we thought it was. And by inviting people into that space of rethinking theology, especially even rethinking it from the perspective of justice and the multi-ethnic family of God, through that process, he has been able to interact with people who went from a place of being angry and only posting insults, where now they have changed, and now they are either praying in their posts, or they're asking him and saying, can you pray with us? You know, and it's that meeting people where they are, and not dismissing their pain and not dismissing their hurt, which is what allowed that to happen.
Thanks for that. Chris, you have anything Nichols?
No, I completely agree. This is a really great conversation. I think the danger for churches like UPC is that we have this struggle. So we tend to be a church that wants to be activist in social work, but we don't want to be activist in spiritual work. And so we have to combine the two, because what we're talking about, the challenge we're talking about, demands a transformative experience of the gospel. So both things have to happen. And it's in the service, I think, that we are confronted by our own brokenness and sin, and then we have to figure out what to do with that. The danger for white people in particular is that by doing good works, they begin to feel good about themselves, and then they actually stop doing justice that makes a difference.
Yeah.
And so we have to be really careful with that. And that's an incredibly difficult problem from the white perspective.
Yeah. Thanks, Chris. You know, there's this question that keeps keeps jumping out at me in the chat, and it's, how do you respond to those who counter Black Lives Matter with All Lives Matter? And I know, Chris, you get it a lot, Chris Thurton, and I know, Chipo, you probably get it as well. You know, how do you, I just heard that today, you know. Black Lives Matter, yeah, but all lives matter. Okay, so how do you guys respond to that? I'll share with you, because the same question they asked me about that is they asked me about, why is there a Black church? Why is it necessary to call it a Black church? And I had to school my brother on that. But what are your thoughts on that?
Chris, you go ahead.
Man, Pastor Chipo, I got way too many thoughts for this. Okay. First response to All Lives Matter. When a people group has been legally not seen as a full person, like as 3/5 of a person, legally by law, that you are not seen as human for the majority of the existence of this country, that's why you got to say Black Lives Matter, because that has not traditionally been the case. And you can't say that's a historical problem. It still is one today, because when you look at the way, I mean, I'm not coming at good cops, but there is something that's broken about our criminal justice system. Yeah. And when you look at the way that there is response, we got video evidence of it. You see the response to white people that have gone in and shot up churches. Yeah. And they peacefully take them out of there. And then there's a man who is just committing like fraud on the street, and he gets choked out to death by a knee. Mm-hmm. He doesn't have a weapon on him. The man goes in with guns and shoots up a church, and they get him out. Yeah. Wow. That's why we say Black Lives Matter. Yeah. Because it's not an argument that other lives matter. It's not an argument that white lives matter. Yes, all lives do matter, but it is disproportionately seen. Yes. In our society. So we have to make the proclamation that Black Lives Matter. We speak it into existence. Yes. I don't even remember the second half of that. Oh, why do we have the Black church? We have the Black church. I mean, I got some good lectures for people, the history of the Black church. I'll leave with this. Not leave, but I'll just say this for the 2 cents of it. One, the Black church was one of the only places that Black people had autonomy during slavery. So they were given a space to worship, because white people thought they had, there were white slave owners that thought they had broken down the gospel or broken down the Bible enough that they could just, and taken things out that they could just give it to them and they'd be subservient. But it was the one space that Black people were given space to rally themselves. And so they rallied behind that and created the Black church. So you had two things. It's become the rallying point for a community. It also becomes the only place that people have dignity and their humanity is seen in whole historically. And so you have a Black church because the white church did not allow Black people in. And so that was it during slavery. Slavery, you have the abolitionist movement. Then as Black people are part of churches, they were literally not allowed to pray, interact, and participate in church fully in the same places. So they went and had to start their own. Yeah. And so as we did that, you see the Black church grow, and it continues in that tradition in a space of being a place that there is dignity and honor and praise, and you're spoken into as a holistic human being, and your plight is actually seen in full, and you're told the gospel that is a holistic one that heals you, and you traditionally didn't get that anywhere else in society.
Mm-hmm. Amen. Yeah. Thank you.
That's good.
Pastor Chipo?
I personally have not been asked that question, but I have reacted to it. Like when I have seen like the posts and the comments, or like, when you see a poster where like if there's something that comes out and you hear the Black Lives Matter movement did something, and then the next day you hear something about maybe the wife of a police officer saying Blue Lives Matter or things like that. And my thought is, going back to what Chris was saying, it's not to say that all lives don't matter, but I think even that statement, Black Lives Matter, is almost like, for me, it's a question. It's like to say, all lives matter, but do you include my life when you're saying that statement? Because the treatment that I have received, or the treatment I have seen my brothers and sisters go through, suggests that Black is not included in the all. And so because of that, that's why we have to say it. It makes me think of, and I'm sharing a lot of personal stuff. I don't know if this is too much, but I grew up in Zimbabwe, and I went to a school that was predominantly white. And so I remember one day we were standing around, it was an all-girls school, and we're just talking, the dumb stuff that teenage girls talk about. And I remember my two friends that at that time, I considered them to be my sisters. But it's when they made their statement, I realized they don't see me, because they were going back and forth to each other talking about because one of the girls was struggling with depression, and we were trying to talk to her about it. And so it came out that her depression was related to her self-image. She didn't value the way that she looked. And so the conversation ended up going to, oh, you're beautiful because you have blonde hair. You're beautiful because you have hazel eyes. You're beautiful because of the shape of your nose is all, like model sharp, or whatever they were saying. And I stood there and I was listening, and I said, so in this process of trying to elevate our sister, what are you guys saying about me? Because I have this curly hair, I have a wide nose. I don't have blonde hair. I have dark eyes. Are you saying that I'm not beautiful? And they didn't know how to respond. And that's when I realized why we say Black Lives Matter is because, yes, there is beauty. Everybody is beautiful, but do you see me?
Yeah. Wow. Thanks for sharing that. I heard, I went to a webinar. It was about trauma awareness, and there was a book that was recommended called My Grandmother's Hands. And I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it talks about racialized trauma and the pathway to mending our hearts and bodies. And it's by a gentleman named Resmaa Menakem. And I'll have to spell that name out for you. See here, Resmaa Menakem. Resmaa is his first name, and then Menakem, Resmaa Menakem. And he has this quote in here that really, it borders on, it talks about all the phrases that we use. And I'm going to read this for you. It says, but all our phrasing, race relations, racial chasm, racial justice, racial profiling, white privilege, even white supremacy, serves to obscure that racism is a visceral experience, that it dislodges brains, blocks airways, rips muscles, extracts organs, cracks bones, breaks teeth. You must always remember that the sociology, the history, the economics, the graphs, the charts, the regressions, all land with great violence upon the body. And what basically that statement is at the end of it, and this is a quote out of Ta-Nehisi Coates' book called Between the World and Me. Between the World and Me. And he said, really, at the end of the day, it's all of this, all of these words, all of these statistics, all of these translate into violence upon the body, that Black bodies matter. And I think that's so, because this is what we see on the streets. This is what we see with police brutality, is that when we see a white man's knee on a Black man's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, we see a body on the street. We see a body, 3 white men, 200-pound white men on the back and on the neck of a Black man. We see a Black body. It's a Black life. but we see a black body. We see Ahmaud Arbery, a black body being shot in the street. And that's the trauma that comes with it. Because once that black body falls, and once that black body's, the breath comes out of that black body, we see that person no more. We see that person no more. And that's the tragedy of the concept of Black Lives Matter, in terms of, I had to tell this man, I said, the reason there's a black church is because we were not allowed in the white church. And when we were allowed in the black church, they put us up in the balcony while we looked down while they were worshiping. Richard Allen walked through the middle of the white church and said, "Hey, I'm a man. I'm a Christian." And he started the African Methodist Church as a result of that. The black church, the black college exists because we were not allowed to go to the white college. And someone asked me, well, now you are allowed to go to white colleges, why do black colleges still exist? I said, I can't believe you asked me that question. I can't believe it, because we still need to know, because we know your history. We know black people know white history. But white people don't know black history. They don't know our history. I know who the black white historians are. I know who they are. I know who the white theologians are. But do white people know black theologians are, and Hispanic theologians are, and Asian theologians are? That's where we need to, they need to study our history to know what we've been through. They know a little bit, but they don't know enough.
Yeah.
And I think that's where for me, that's where the challenge comes, is because we're expected to assimilate into the culture, and we have to counter that and say, hey, do you know our history? Well, let me stop there because I can start preaching.
Thank you, Pastor Aaron. So the comment has been made that we're already at 90 minutes. And so the thought is that we should probably do closing remarks and let everybody get on with the rest of their evening.
Amen. Closing remarks. Who wants to start with closing remarks? I think I just gave mine.
There you go. Oh man. I can go. I'll say this. I've been reflecting on this, and this has been a question I've got a lot, is about the riots and the protesting and whatnot. And I'll say that there hasn't been, like, if you look at the history of America, America was built on protests and riots. Literally went to war with the British. I mean, as we know it today. Before that, it was built on stolen land, but that's a different topic, but I'm just going to put it out there. But you look at the Boston Tea Party, you look at this, like, that's rioting. You look at anytime there's been major change in this world, has come on the backs of protests that often have led into riots. What we need to recognize here is there's a difference between protesting and riots and anarchy. And right now we're seeing anarchists take over some of these peaceful protests and even some of these riots that are coming from a place of frustration and anger that are spilling over, that in some places are actually justifiable. But when anarchists come in and take over and then just anarchy is just creating chaos for the sake of chaos. And so we need to start to recognize what the difference is going on there. And protesting is a fundamental piece of the American makeup. And that is a way that change is actually occurs. And as we talked about cleaning up, you said something earlier, Pastor Aaron, as followers of Jesus, we should be the first ones out there to clean up. I'm not going to put this on everybody, but one of my convictions is as a follower of Jesus, I want to be one of the first people out there on the front lines and one of the first people to help clean up at the same time. I want to do both. And so how do we live into that and recognize that? And I'd just be my encouragement is as we see some of these protests and riots and things got out of hand, how do we recognize the difference between the protests and riots and the straight anarchy that's happening in some places?
Yeah. Good. Pastor Chipo, you have any closing remarks?
Trying to think of something short to say, as pastors. I think the thing that I wanted to say, I just wanted to say thank you to all of the participants who did join today, because otherwise without you, we'd be talking to ourselves, right? So thank you for being here. And I also just want to say thank you to Chris and Pastor Aaron for inviting me, because this was healing for me, to be able to have a place to talk about this. I think one of the things that I went through in my process of trying to just reconcile everything that's been going on, you still have to do your work and prepare for, ministering to other people. And for me, that means working with the students. And in the process of doing that, I was reminded in one of the lessons that I was prepping for them, and the lesson had nothing to do with, what we're talking about, but Scripture has a way of breaking into where you are and bringing your context into what God is saying in the text. And one of the things that I was reminded of is that even though we're lamenting, and that sometimes when we look at the situations that are happening, we're not alone in it. So even though it might look hopeless, it's not hopeless because we're not alone, and that God is still present and that he is still working, he's still active in the midst of it. And so that's just something that I just wanted to share with anybody who is grieving, who is going through hurt, who's going through confusion, who's asking the questions. God is not scared of your questions. And I think that reminder was something that was helpful for me, is to remember that he's not afraid of what's happening. He's not afraid of the questions. He's not afraid of the anger, the frustration, the lament, and all of that. And to be able to know that he is there with us in that process is what gave me hope. Because one of the things that I shared with the students is that whether we believe in God or not, trouble is going to happen. And so the thing that we have to decide is, do we want to go through that trouble with him or without him? And I would rather go through it with him than without.
Amen. Thanks so much for that.
So good.
Chris Nichols.
The only thing I'd say is that what we've been talking about tonight is not a side issue. This isn't a specialized issue we're talking about. It's the heart of the gospel. As we engage issues of justice, we understand what's happening around us. It's the way of revival. It's the way God comes with power. And until we engage these things, we won't see that. I think that's the major block in the American white church, why it's dying. And because we refuse to go here. This is a work of the Spirit, and we need to say yes.
Amen. Amen. I just, first of all, just want to thank everyone for being on this panel. I think this is an ongoing process. We have a lot to learn, but the gospel, the church is the gospel made visible, and we have to lean into that reality. We've gone through 6 weeks in interchurch small groups and reading Sarah Shin's book. I think all of the work that we've done together as 3 churches has prepared us for this moment, and this is why Kindred exists. And in many ways, this is why the church exists. The church exists. The church should be at its best in moments of crisis that's going on in society. We should be the most courageous, the most articulate. When we should be the best thinkers did not run away from the ideologies of our day. We should be able to think through those things with the mind of Christ. And that's my conviction, that's my philosophy. And I think as three churches that have come together, we are better together. We've had discussions that we never would have had we been in isolation.
Yeah.
Had ECC stayed on the other side of the tracks and Mount Zion stayed on its side of town, and the day George Hemmond visited Mount Zion was the day that we began this journey together. Came off a sabbatical, visited Mount Zion, and wanted to get to know me. And that day was the day that Kindred started. This is why we're here today. And so I'm just excited to see what God has done, what he is doing, and what he's getting ready to do. And we all play a role in that. So that's my story. And as James Brodden said, I'm sticking to it.
There you go.
Amen. Amen. Well, Mr. Nichols, you have any closing thoughts? Well, you just said something.
I said plenty. So no, we've done great. Thank you very much.
Amen. Amen. Thanks, everyone.
Can we pray before we take off?
Thank you.
Yes.
Can we pray? Can we pray?
Yeah.
Please do.
Oh, me? Okay, I'll pray for it. Jesus, we just are grateful for this space. God, I pray that this would be a catalyst. I pray that no one would sit here and think that the work is done because of this conversation, but they would be reminded of the truth of who you are, that you are a God that acts, that you are a God that moves mountains, that you're a God that raises the dead, that you are a God that does miracles. And so, God, we're praying for a miracle right now, that our country would be healed, that you would bring justice to our country, God. We pray that the voices that are crying out would be heard, God, and that people would respond. Jesus, we just pray and lament and grieve with those that are grieving, God. We step into this conversation knowing that this is just a conversation, and we look to step into the lives of those that are hurting, God. So we just we pray again that this is a catalyst. We thank you for what you've done, God. Anything that's not from us, God, we just pray will be forgotten. And everything that is from you, we joked about being preachers. We did preach a lot. And so whatever is from you, Jesus, I just pray would be imprinted on our hearts, and that would move us to empathy, and that empathy would move us into action. So Jesus, we thank you for what you've done. We thank you for what you're doing, and we thank you for what you do. And we commit all of this, our prayers said and unsaid, to you. In your name, Jesus. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Peace.